I'm Kerry Bannigan, founder of the Conscious Fashion Campaign. Today, I'm joined by Jill Dumain, CEO of Bluesign Technologies, to discuss moving into the future through supply chain partnerships and transparency. Thank you all for joining and welcome, Jill.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So to begin, tell us about Bluesign and your journey to CEO.
Oh, I'm happy to. It's been a long road with Bluesign. So we've just celebrated our 20th anniversary, which we're very excited about.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Really pioneering this space. And at the beginning of Bluesign, I actually was a client and learned about them very early on in their journey because I worked for Patagonia, a clothing brand in California, known for their sustainability work. So we were on one of the initial tours Bluesign did to see if their idea had some legs to it and had merit. So at the time, I was managing all the fabric development and technology for the company. And from a sustainability standpoint, we had a lot of things covered, even back then, from fiber procurement, whether it was recycled polyester or organic cotton, and we had this end of life, or now what we call the circular economy program going. But we really were missing this chemical management component and resource management. And that's what Bluesign started saying, we know how to make it cleaner, we know how to make it more efficient, whether it's water or energy or less hazardous chemicals, let's bring this to the industry. And it was music to my ears at the time because we really were missing that slot of the trifecta of bringing in environmentalism, textiles, and chemistry. You could find them independently, but not experts that had all three. So Bluesign was music to my ears. We were one of the early adopters of it. Personally, I was an advocate and ended up recruiting a lot of different competitors to come and listen to Bluesign's message as well. And that was part of the reason Bluesign really grew in the outdoor industry. It proved to be a very good place for them to focus because the textiles are very diverse and very complicated, from 3 to 4 layer coated fabrics to cotton t-shirts and everything in between. So it was a really good proving ground for the company, for the system, the approach, input stream management, to see that it worked in these different kinds of supply chains. And then after 28 years at Patagonia, my predecessor, Peter Weber, was leading the company of Bluesign, and I got recruited to come over to Switzerland. And I decided, that sounds like an interesting challenge. So I've just started my 5th year.
Wow, congratulations. And it speaks volumes to go from learning about this to joining as a client to then taking the seat as CEO. So congratulations
Absolutely.
on all of that. And I think it says a lot for what Bluesign has achieved and what it's got going on with members, which we'll come to later on. Now, historically, supply chains have had the challenges with actually remaining transparent and sustainable. Do you believe that we could be moving away from this? And have you noticed any positive trends with the companies that you partner with?
I don't think industry has a choice to move away from it anymore. And Las Vegas used to have an advertising slogan, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Now you could say what happens in Vegas goes to Pinterest, to Instagram, to Facebook, to Twitter. Like, we don't live in secret anymore as a society. And I think especially the younger generations that are coming up, they're used to living a transparent life. Like, they've got their life, what they had for dinner and breakfast and, whatever. They're just used to living this transparent life. And I think it's an expectation. I also think, though, that transparency can go too far, to be quite honest. And I've experienced that in my career, where it's not always beneficial to come out when you're in the middle of a big problem, because it can be interpreted so many different ways that sometimes you need a little time behind the scenes to figure out the direction you're going, but then become transparent about it and tell what you're doing, tell where you've been, tell where you're going. And we had this one experience when I was at Patagonia as well that really struck me. We were building a website showing supply chains, and we were proud we could go all the way back to our farms and identify who they were. And we got pushback from some saying, this is where we send our children to school from. I'm not sure I want this address on your website. And it made me really take this step back. Like, do I want my personal address on our website? I'm technically part of the supply chain as well. So it was finding this balance of not just doing it because you could, but doing it because it was going to make something better. And I think that's really where I see transparency landing, is absolutely the more companies are bold enough and brave enough to talk about where the problems are and then their plan to fix them, I think it's really good for the industry. But I really don't think it's much of a choice anymore.
And are you seeing that with the companies that you partner with? And, you know, when you talk about these bold choices, it's really interesting when it comes to the supply chain. Can you talk us more through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it looks different for every company. You know, I've been reading a lot about online lately about the regenerative agricultural movement. And though Bluesign doesn't go down to the field level, where our scope is higher up in the supply chain, starting with the chemical companies, there's a lot of brands that are talking now about the regenerative agriculture, and the fact that they can go down to the farms, it's really, really good. And they start to know who the people are in their supply chain. And when you look at buying cotton for whatever a pound and how that translates into a t-shirt, and you meet the person growing it, suddenly it has a very different meaning than just buying a bale of cotton from somewhere in the world. So I've been really excited to see a lot of that work that I was, you know, pioneering years ago on how to bring this forward in a meaningful way, that it's teaching the consumers you can't just flip a switch. These supply chains are long and complicated. And if you want to pull something through, there's a lot of pieces that have to be considered and have to be included. And so for me, I think it's a huge benefit for the consumers to understand more what the companies have to do in order to bring these sustainability initiatives further.
And you touch on something there that I think is really important, is the human element. So we are always conditioned, especially in the industry, to talk about the supply chain or overall the value chain. But the reality is it's a human chain of transactions and work and supply and relationships. And I think the more that all of us along that chain understand this is a human chain, that's where we have to seek to do better. And I like that you speak about the importance of that human element, because that is so forgotten. And now what we're seeing, especially with the pandemic, is so much coming to light about what has gone wrong. And in that, it's now time to focus on the human element of things. And speaking of the pandemic, as many of us know, COVID-19 has brought with it significant disruption to the industry supply chains. What impacts have you witnessed? And is this now an opportunity to promote sustainability and transparency as we move towards our recovery as a sector?
I do. And I mean, I have to, I'll give full disclosure. I'm a pretty extreme optimist by nature. So yeah. I often can see sort of the pathway out of something that maybe looks disastrous into something else. I also think it's the benefit of all these gray hairs and having done this for nearly 30 years now, where I was talking to some younger people kind of around 30 a few months ago, and they were so depressed about COVID that sustainability was just hitting this tipping point, and now COVID. And I was like, oh my, oh no, this is still really good, you guys. You know, there were all these commitments, all this energy from the governmental level, which you've been working so hard in with the UN SDGs, down to startups and their Kickstarter campaigns or their fundraising campaigns. They all show their supply chains. They all show their sustainability initiatives. And if you look at those, you know, the baby startups, it's almost like if you don't have it, don't bother in a way, all the way up to the large fashion luxury brands making these commitments. And so I think COVID is a bit of an interruption. And somebody described it to me once that in your car, if your carburetor is not working great, you can kind of still sputter along. And that's where sustainability is. You can kind of keep going, but COVID's a flat tire. You're not going anywhere. So you have to fix your flat tire before you worry about your carburetor. But it's not forever. So I think the momentum the industry had leading up to COVID, it's a long blip, feels like now, but I think when we look back in a few years, it's going to feel like a shorter blip. And for me, I've been super encouraged this year by some of the newer brands working on initiatives, still really plowing forward on the sustainability work. And maybe it's all working from home. We don't commute now. We have more time. I don't know. It doesn't feel like we have more time. But I am optimistic about where the industry is still heading. And I don't think COVID will take the sustainability away. But I am hopeful that seeing deeper into the supply chains and coming up, and a lot of stories in the mainstream press of the disruption to the people deep in the supply chain. And I think those are the ones that are often the faceless ones that we don't think about in that way.
Yeah, and thank you, Flan. It's interesting when you mentioned about the youth, and I think the youth have been given this burden of responsibility that they didn't ask for. They've inherited this mess in a way of other generations before them, and they want to step up, and they've been given a voice, and it's incredible to see what the youth are doing. But to your point, it's like COVID is giving us that moment to now say, how do we play in their part of recovery? Who has the assets? Who has the resources? What can we do? Because we each have our different part that we can do. Is it about redistributing wealth? Because over here, there's financials to back the innovations that you're mentioning, that you're seeing. And I will say the creativity on the side of the innovations for sustainable solutions is incredible, that is starting to be put forward. And actually, even to correct myself there, maybe it's not even starting. Maybe it's just now time that they're being seen and heard, because they're needed more than ever. That disruption for innovation was before the industry was moving along. And now there's that platform for all these great solutions, to join Bluesign and so forth.
Now, I mean, our whole lives have been a big disruption for the last year now, right? We're heading to Chinese New Year's again when it all started, or Lunar New Year. So, it's sort of like you realize what we were doing, life can still go on in a different way. And not that anybody wants to sustain this for sure. But I also think sort of what this new normal becomes is, what do we leave behind? There are some pieces, whether it's your personal life or your professional life or our industry, probably thinking, you know what, I don't need to put that back in. And so it's that cliche of take the best and leave the rest. But I really think the industry has that opportunity right now. And to think about, with disrupted supply chains, how do you secure it more going forward? How do you form a tighter bond with your suppliers all the way down the chain? And that was another thing that was really impressive to me about Bluesign and bringing back the human component. When I was a client, not only does Bluesign go to the textile mill, but to the chemical manufacturer. And when I was sitting in the brand chair, I just thought, there's never a chance I could be a big enough company to go all the way back to all my chemical suppliers and ensure that people are being taken care of there, up to the textile mill, the surrounding communities, and really turning this me society into the we society. And it's not just people in China or people in Bangladesh, like there's faces that come with that now. And my hope is that relationships, so consumers and citizens saw it in the newspapers, the industry people saw it daily. So that's my hope, is that, once you see the faces and the people, it's not just a country or a factory, it's humans, and we're all part of the same supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what do you believe are currently the biggest barriers to getting companies to prioritize sustainability and transparency within the supply chains? And then as we go through that, tell us where it connects to what does Bluesign do to address these?
I mean, for me, I think knowledge is a big one. And on one hand, there's so much information out there today. It's a little bit opposite from where I started, when there was no rule book, there was no guidebook, and we sort of fell in a lot of potholes and pitfalls that we tried to educate people to miss the next time around. But the flip side right now is there's so many things you could do that I also think that can be very overwhelming for somebody starting. Like, where do you start? How do you prioritize? What can you say no to today? So I think really working with companies, and that's one thing we do with brands. We have a product called a brand assessment, which is in essence a whole sustainability review that then we go to our clients with a roadmap, a gap analysis of where they think they are, where we think they are, where we think they could do better, and then a roadmap to get there. And we have very experienced people doing it, industry veterans that have done this for brands themselves. And it's using this knowledge from the expertise and educating them. It's okay to say no or not yet to this. This is really where your hot spot is. This is where you should focus in, because that's a risk for you. And then these other things, they'll come along, but do it step by step to where you can digest what you're biting off, and not trying to take the whole gamut of what you can do in sustainability today, because you won't be able to. Something will come off the table. So I think those are some of I mean, in a way, a good difficulty is how do you choose what makes the most sense for your company?
And I think to that point, can I just ask quickly there, when you talk about the companies, this audience really varies from Fashinnovation. We have got the entrepreneur that is starting out, to somebody that's been in the game for a couple of years and maybe has got 1 or 2 team members, to them much larger C-suite decision makers sitting here watching. Is there barriers here for everybody, and are they the same?
I think they are different, but I have to, there's a story that just popped in my mind when you asked that question, where when I was sort of the evangelist in this part of the industry, going to trade shows saying, can I talk to anybody that'll talk to me about sustainability? And then I would get excuses. We're too big, we're too small, we're public, we're private. Like, there was always a reason why it couldn't be done. And my response was, just pick one style, then just pick something. So I'm a firm believer that no matter where you are in the supply chain, you can find something to begin. It might be very small, you might feel like it's insignificant, but in your world, it's significant. And that was something that I really tried to encourage, and still do, companies that are just beginning. And coming from Patagonia, everybody assumes it's sustainability nirvana there. It's pretty good, but I will say we were held to margins and business and money, and it wasn't just a free-for-all NGO as well. I mean, we had to work towards it, and that was something I felt really strongly about, because if we were going to be an example, or any company is going to be an example, it has to make business sense. We're not going to get throughout the whole industry until it makes business sense. So often people say to Bluesign, why aren't you an NGO? I thought you were a nonprofit. It's like, no, actually, we believe in the profitability, because if we can't make it work, we're not going to hit the whole industry. It has to work from an economic standpoint.
That's a really good piece of advice for brands to take as well when looking at their own business. I feel like a lot of brands, especially when they're starting out in sustainability, have that guilt of pricing and margins, but you have to have them in place so that you can actually sustain your business, to sustain everyone in your supply chain the proper way.
And nobody wants to be an environmental or sustainability martyr. Like, there's a place and time for it all. And I mean, we need to move quick. The earth is crying for that. But on the other hand, we have to move at a cadence that can be supported, because there's nothing more just disempowering or discouraging to have to go back on something you worked so hard to do because it didn't work for whatever reason. So I'm a huge proponent of as fast as you can, but as much as you can digest as well.
Now, before we move to welcoming audience questions, I'd like to just, from your side, what are some of the next steps that the audience members can do to actually take action?
No, I think that's a great question, because there's a lot that can be done no matter, again, where you sit in the supply chain. And I mean, like I said before, there is so much information out there today. And my biggest advice to companies just beginning is find which environmental or sustainability initiatives meet your company's values. So if you're an outdoor industry making ocean products, clean water, pollution, your customers are going to care about that. Your executives are going to care about that. If you're a fashion company that's selling to the young group, we know youth is looking at this more than ever before. So don't be afraid to talk about your initiatives, however big or small, because we need this collective voice to make it easy for our consumers to choose where to go. And I think some of the actions is starting small. Like at Bluesign, we have access to all of our system partners, all of our clients that are selling Bluesign product. That's free on our website. Anybody can go to bluesign.com, look up all these suppliers, and go and ask them, what are your Bluesign fabrics? Then you know the chemistry at the textile mill, at the chemical manufacturer is taken care of, that the best resources are being used to make that product. And it doesn't cost you anything. If you have a little bit more change in your pocket and you want to take the next step, maybe doing a brand assessment, see where you want to land. What does that look like? And then we have the full service option of a system partnership, and then you have access to the whole organization. And I think a lot of service providers are set up that way, where there can be this sort of tiered approach into the organization, acknowledging that the startups and the younger companies don't have as many resources. But even, I will say, I've spoken to people from very, very large brands, but they don't have support inside to spend the money. So same, start with this reference list at Bluesign. See who you're already buying from. You might already have some of your suppliers on there. And if not, then you have a few hundred to choose from that are making all sorts of textiles.
Thank you so much. I'm starting to see the questions coming in. And before I just move over to that, I want to echo as a point of action. Anne-Marie this morning, who is from the United Nations Office of Partnerships, she mentioned in her opening address that recently the Conscious Fashion and Lifestyle Network has launched, and it is welcoming industry stakeholders to showcase actions, report progress, and share solutions accelerating the SDGs. We will work with the Fashinnovation team to share this link along with the links to resources that Jill has shared. So here we go. First question is in here. Jill, do you feel the lack in a unified meaning of sustainability is a problem in terms of why we're not moving forward faster in that realm?
That's an interesting question, because I think it's a question that's been asked for a very, very long time. What is sustainability? What is that definition? And as the question says, if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers on it. I mean, yes and no. Yes, in that if there was a very clear, defined, agreed upon definition, maybe it would be easier. But on the other hand, if it is broad enough to allow people to enter in a way that they feel they can, then it doesn't bother me so much. And I think back to, again, just stories of companies that would come and say, hey, we're using our low impact dyes, we're sustainable. Okay, what do you mean by low impact? Why is it low impact? What is it? And there, so the prodding to go a little bit deeper, to understand a bit more, it's all part of the journey, I think, of educating the industry, educating individuals to come to what those actions are. I honestly, I don't think the lack of unified meaning is the biggest problem.
And I think now,
what do you think though, Kerry?
No, and it is an interesting term. And one of the things in my work with the Conscious Fashion campaign is, sustainability as a definition is vague and yet complex. And we're seeing this from big to small companies and organizations and what's going on. And in my work, it's very focused on how can we maybe use the Sustainable Development Goals as an existing framework to have some unified language to move forward. How can we work off of these 17 goals with 169 targets to frame what is the blueprint to move forward together, cross-sector as well, never mind just within the fashion industry. And that's why we point to the SDGs, again, as this optional framework that does exist and has been adopted by many, many countries, and now businesses and leaders and NGOs. But again, it's not that 100% and one definition of what sustainability is. And another question here, do you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to say, I think one thing that the Sustainable Development Goals does really well is take that next layer from the goal. For example, the infrastructure and innovation one. When I read that goal, thought, God, that's perfect for our industry because we need the infrastructure of our supply chains in order to move forward. And of course, innovation is at the heart. But then you read a little deeper, and infrastructure in theirs is about highways and inter-border transportation and making that simpler. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because from my head and my experience, I took it in a really different way. But that then brought me back into the definition, like, okay, let's stick there, because there's going to be a place for what I'm thinking, but it's just not in this one spot.
Yeah, and that's actually very interesting, because I always say to people in the fashion sector, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you can look at the surface level of the 17, but make sure you dive into the targets, because it can help you build your milestones. So just before we wrap up, in a few of your answers, you have touched on the word partnerships. So I would love to ask you, what role do partnerships play in advancing sustainability and transparency in supply chains?
I think they're absolutely critical. And speaking from experience, when I, for 14 years, was in a product development role, if I didn't have my partners in the supply chain, I couldn't have done 75% of my work, because it got to a point where they trusted me, I trusted them, they needed me, I needed them. So it really grew into some of the equal partnerships built on trust and long-term business. And so I could do so much more innovation in my job than I could have if I was changing suppliers on a regular basis or trying to squeeze every last cent out of them. They're not motivated to work for you then. And if you have the ability to build these long-term ones, the financial piece gets made up, because it's expensive to change suppliers. You have mistakes. They don't know how to service you as a client. There's a lot of cost involved in moving around. So I think that having trusted partnerships really, I mean, I feel like magic can happen in the industry when you've got that, because then you're firing, and all these reasons we all got into this industry. It's fun, it's creative. And I think so often sustainability or responsibility can feel like this weight and this burden instead of this empowerment. Like, not only do you get to do this, really work in this very fun industry with all these creative minds, but now you can do good for the world at the same time. And bringing those two together, once you have it, you can't go back. You're sort of stuck in that mode for the rest of your career, no matter what. But it's a fabulous place to be.
Well, Jill, I cannot thank you enough for this. And I like the words there about trust, empowerment, magic, moving forward, and most of all, how we can collaborate and really build upon ensuring the supply chains can be transparent as we aim for a sustainable recovery. Thank you so much for being with us today.
And to you, Kerry,